Hello, bonjour, Clay. Thank you everyone for coming out. My name is Bradley Cooper. I'm a policy analyst who works closely with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I'm joined today with three panelists who sit on the board of directors of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples in order to present a little bit about the work that we do. So for today's side event, I'm going to give just a brief overview of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples so you can get to know who we are, who we represent. We then have some prepared speeches by our panelists going over some different topics that we think are important for the international community to discuss at this venue. And then we'll close it up with a bit of a question and answer period if anyone has anything that might come up during that time. So as we proceed through the slides, as the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, next slide, we'd like to define ourselves first by our value system, what we stand for, what we represent. Whenever it comes to our Indigenous identity, it's not rooted just in our blood or anything else. It's really defining again who we are, what we represent. And for this, we have a vision that we've prepared through the works of our board of directors, our membership. It's been reviewed over a 2-year period, reassessed most recently last year. This is defining what we see as the future for Canada. And so when reading it off, all Indigenous peoples in Canada will experience the highest quality of life founded on the rebuilding of our nations. All Indigenous citizens will be rightfully treated with respect, dignity, integrity, and equality. So all the work that the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples does is rooted within this mission system. This is what we believe. So again, a little bit who we are beyond just our vision. We're one of 5 national Indigenous organizations recognized by the Government of Canada. The others being the Assembly of First Nations, representing the voice of First Nations individuals, the Métis National Council, representing the voice of Métis individuals, the Inuit Tapik Kanatami, representing the voice of Inuit people, the Native Women's Alliance of Canada, representing Indigenous women, and the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, who represents the voice of authors, status, and non-status Indians, Métis, and Southern Inuit Aboriginal peoples. We have this recognition as one of the federally recognized national Indigenous organizations since 1971, when we were founded as the Native Council of Canada. Though we have changed our name, our mission still stays the same. We've continued to have a federal voice since 1971. We serve as the national voice for our 11 provincial territorial affiliate organizations. We also hold ECOSOC status with the United Nations. We've been presenting to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues for over a decade. We're very well familiar with a lot of the international community's history with colonization across the world and the fight that all Indigenous people share in trying to make the world a better future for Indigenous peoples. Next slide. If you wish to learn more about the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, we do have a website, abopeoples.org. You can feel free to peruse that. If you approach us after the presentation today, we also have some handouts we can provide you, which you can follow up on a bit more information. Next slide. Our 2 executives is our National Chief Elmer St. Pierre and our National Vice Chief Kim Bowden. They've been heavily involved within Indigenous rights and advocacy within Canada for many decades at this point. Unfortunately, Canada has this history of conducting conferences at the same time as the United Nations does, so fortunately they're busy in Canada fighting their own fights within Canadian borders, but we do have a variety of presentations that we can provide today through our panelists, showing a lot of the work and advocacy that still continues with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples within Canada. Next slide shows off our 11 provincial territorial affiliates. Rather than going through the list of all of them, I will bring your attention to the 2 that we have for panelists today. In the middle row on the farthest right, you'll see the logo for the new Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council, which we have Chief and President Brendan Moore with us here today as one of our panelists. On the bottom, to the farthest right, is the Native Council of Prince Edward Island, which is also represented here by President Chief Lisa Cooper. In addition to our 11 provincial territorial affiliates, on the next slide, we have our 2 national councils that we have, the National Elders Council, as well as the National Youth Council. For the National Youth Council, we have our National Youth representative here today, who will also be presenting, Jessica Savoy. And so that brief introduction out of the way, I do want to give the majority of today's time to our panelists to give their discussion. We'll begin first with a discussion on identity and distinctions-based approach with Chief and President Brendan Moore with the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council. Chief Moore.
Hello everyone, I wanted to thank you all for coming here today. I'm from Mi'kmaq, which is an Indigenous nation on the east coast of Canada. We were first contacted by Europeans in the 1500s, and so we've been mixing with Europeans for over 400 years now. One of our chiefs in 1610, our chief member 2 went to the Vatican was baptized, and we became a Catholic nation. As you'll see our flag up in the right corner, we have the cross and the star and the crescent moon. So it's been a long time that we've been dealing with identifying with who we are in these dynamic relationships as the world connects with each other. So I'm the great-great-grandson of Susan McCurdy, a Mi'kmaq woman from Mariah First Nation in Quebec. I'm the great-grandson of Louisa Hartwell, who is Susan's daughter, and Michael Francis, a Mi'kmaq man from Elsipogtog, which was known as Big Cove First Nation. I'm the grandson of Gerald Hartwell, a Mi'kmaq man who was adopted and removed from Big Cove in order to avoid having to go to residential school. This is where my family's off-reserve story started. And then he was forced to enfranchise to participate in the military as he went to participate in the Korean War, which is where my family's non-status story started. I'm the son of Deborah Hartwell, who was a non-status and off-reserve Mi'kmaq woman, and she was where our family's fight to regain our rights started. My mother joined the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council in 1981 as a single mother with 2 young children. My sister Wendy Wetland, who was 7 years old at the time, and myself, who was 8 months old. She was looking for a community where she could belong, and we found that with other disenfranchised Indigenous people at the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council. At that time, the Government of Canada fully denied our rights as Indigenous people, and the Chief and Council of Elsipogtog, known as Big Cove in those days, wanted nothing to do with us. So the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council became an extremely important and dynamic part of our life. We went from being alone with nowhere to fit into society to being part of a strong grassroots movement, which was driven forward by our matriarchs. I remember piling in the back of pickup trucks with dozens of other children and driving to homes where our mothers would care for all the children, cooking meals and making sure we were entertained while having meetings, fundraising, and building our community from the ground up. In 1973, the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council was formed to fight for the rights of Indigenous women who were disenfranchised from their communities and their status as Indians in Canadian law. For the first decade, all the leaders of our communities were matriarchs, and as matriarchs tend to do, they expanded the objectives of our community to accept and fight for the rights of all disenfranchised Indigenous people. This is when we became a council of off-reserve communities on our traditional territory, covering the 4 corners of New Brunswick. In New Brunswick, we have 3 nations from the Wabanaki Confederacy who are all signatories to the Peace and Friendship Treaties with the Crown. These nations are the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqiyik, and the Passamaquoddy. This made us an inclusive, diverse, and heterogeneous community of sovereign Indigenous people who have found solace in family and uniting together. Early on, our matriarchs pushed our chief to provide a space for our youth to be able to grow together and to regain our culture and to foster an inclusive, joyful environment where we can have fun together while being ourselves. Our chief at the time, Gary Gould, obliged him to take land where we built our summer camp. This was massive for our community, as we finally had a place where we belonged, where I belonged, while being myself. I didn't need to suppress or hide any part of me. At that time, Indigenous people weren't accepted by the non-Indigenous community, but I wasn't Indian enough to be accepted by my reservation. Over the years, we, the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council, won lawsuit after lawsuit validating who we are and our rights. This was well before UNDRIP, and we were beating the colonialists at their own game. In 1993, my uncle, Lloyd Hartwell, won a lawsuit against the Crown when he was charged for poaching moose. He was arrested and had his truck and gun taken from him, which were vital for sustaining our family. Elders from the New Brunswick Aboriginal people and our reservation testified to who we are and that they knew us. From that point on, we have been status Indians in Canadian law. As a family, we were excited about this and tried to approach Elsipogtog, our reservation community under Canadian law, where our cousins lived, but the Indian Act Chief and Council still refused to treat us as a member of the community and denied us our rights under the Indian Act. We found out it didn't matter what we did or how we approached Elsipogtog. We would never be accepted by this community whose colonial structure is designed and determined by the Crown. All that this ended up accomplishing was reinforcing the communal validity and inclusive, holistic nature of the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council. Family after family obtained their status cards and were not welcomed into their historical Indian Act reservations. What did happen is we were recognized as an Indigenous community when we signed an agreement with the Crown, the UNBI and the Indians, which represented 12 reserves, and the Maui, who represent the other 3 reservations. This agreement made us the 16th reservation when negotiating and settling land claims. This was huge because we still had a large population of our community who were non-status Indians. This could have caused a division, but it wasn't our nature to disenfranchise our community members. We grew up together as youth and as a family. We continued to fight for the rights of everyone in our community, and we eventually gained recognition in law for the 9 non-status Indians through the Daniels decision in 2016. This is when the Liberal government of Canada began to develop the ideology that the distinction-based approach when negotiating with Indigenous groups in Canada. They shifted the language from Indians, Métis, and Inuit to First Nations, Métis and Inuit. First Nations being the colonial controlled municipalities known as reservations rather than all Indians. Before this, there were 5 organizations in Canada which the Crown recognized as representing the diverse and heterogeneous Indigenous populations in Canada. 1 for the reservations, 1 for the Métis, 1 for the Inuit, 1 for the Native women of Canada, and 1 for the disenfranchised status and non-status, which is who we represent as the Congress of Aboriginal People. What the government has done is to pursue a path to recolonize our sovereignty through division and a perversion of self-determination, while ignoring our inherent right to choose who represents us. They did this by elevating very specific groups to represent the reservations, the Métis and the Inuit, as the structures to lord over all of the Indigenous people in Canada. Canada leveraged resources as a tool to have those organizations exclude 85% of the Indigenous people who are off reserve and non-status, as well as our matriarchs. That's a great deal for the Canadian government, as they were able to dismiss 85% of their liability, and a better bad deal for the exclusive organizations that represent the reservations, the Métis and the Inuit. They are still extremely underfunded and are being forced to exclude their brothers and sisters for a few more dollars while compromising their rights to self-determine by being forced to mirror colonial establishments in order to self-govern. They justify this through racist and misogynistic ideologies. They argue that there are only 3 distinct groups of Indigenous people in Canada: First Nations, who are represented by the reservations, the Métis, and the Inuit. The Crown in Canada has decided that they do not need to recognize the inherent rights of the Indigenous population who choose alternate representation, and instead are trying to force us into the racist and misogynistic matrix which they have built to recolonize and subjugate Indigenous people to organizations and municipalities that have no resemblance to our holistic and sovereign identities or nations. This restructuring has developed slowly since it was initiated by the Liberal government by pressing identity politics and their ever-increasing desire to create division through redefining words and forcing Indigenous people to define themselves in colonial languages in a manner that mirrors colonial constructs. The Crown loves definitions because they validate their discriminatory worldview while devouring our holistic worldview. The Liberal government loves identity politics because it causes division between the people by creating distinct groups to validate individuals based off the small differences and preferences in the manner that those people live their life, while devouring the holistic nature of accepting people as people who are sovereign to live their life as they please and who are able to validate themselves. The present day consequences that we see from this is that the Indian Act councils are able to pick and choose who they may help. My mother, the champion that she is, won a human rights case against our reservation just last year for discriminatory treatment. I could follow suit, but that isn't my community. This is my community. The Liberal government, with the support of the NDP, blocked both the Congress of Aboriginal People and the Native Women's Association of Canada from having a seat on the National Reconciliation Committee, which disenfranchises 85% of Indigenous people and our matriarchs from the reconciliation process through colonial practices and lateral violence from the Indigenous organizations who lobby against us in order to have more power, more money, more resources, more land, and 100% of our voice. These organizations held a side event 2 days ago featuring the idea of Indigenous theft identity. This is a problem that we deal with ourselves, which is why I attended. I was hoping to get some insight and gain some knowledge and wisdom that I could bring back to help protect my community. Instead, it flipped to lateral violence within minutes, which brought back all of my feelings that I had as a child being looked at as an imposter by people who I love in my heart. They didn't only direct the idea of identity theft that individuals have no ancestry or community connections to Indigenous peoples, but they became an echo chamber of identity politics by ironically stealing our identity, by deciding that they get to define us, that they are the sole heirs of our inheritance, and that only select developments of UNDRIP are valid because of their interpretation of UNDRIP supersedes that of others. They do this with the narrative that they are more Indigenous than us because of the different paths that our ancestor took in order to survive colonization. They do this in order to steal our inheritance, our voice, and our right to self-determination, identification, and interpretation. They do this to displace us from tables where negotiations are evolving and which lay the path for our current youth and future generations. They even have initiatives in motion to displace us from being able to be here with our brothers and sisters from around the world. Their goal is no less than to complete a cultural genocide in a fashion that mirrors that of the Crown and the colonial governments that attempted on all of us to wipe out our communities and our matriarchs from the map. Even more recently, they blocked our women from being able to participate equitably in a summit to discuss progress and moving forward in relation to the great work that our matriarchs have done and accomplished in regards to the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. Our response to that was to rent the conference room next door and to hold an inclusive event that featured our leaders, our matriarchs, our elders, and our youth from one end of Canada to the other. We had a lot of support from grassroots individuals, but the three organizations in the Liberal government would not allow our women and young women to participate equitably. In fact, they treated us as if we were protesting the meeting ourselves. Two of our matriarchs, one an elder and one a youth, started drumming a prayer song in order to support the women who were without our support by letting them know that we were here and that we were praying for them. This resulted in security, giant white men putting hands on our women mid-prayer. Chief Cooper, who's sitting next to me, almost got arrested trying to put herself in between the security guards and our women. I can't imagine the entitlement that these men must feel to justify putting their hands on our women at a missing and murdered Indigenous Women's Summit. We were as good as kicked out of the building, but not before Chief Augustine, Chief Cooper, and President LaValle got access to the meeting through a Zoom call, where they were able to call out the discrimination and the erasure of our people from a nightmare where our people are 70% of the victims. Now, to say all of this isn't to say that we want to demonize the communities of people who are subjugated under the structures, as the grassroots people aren't the issue. It's some of their leaders. One of these organizations even forces their family members, who have both an inherent right and a legal right to be a member of that community, to sign away their sovereignty to the organization in order to qualify for benefits and rights under the Indian Act. We want what we always want, what we've always represented. We want to recognize the beauty in what we can achieve as an inclusive, diverse, and heterogeneous confederation of Indigenous people. We love them. We have space in our hearts for them. It's our family. It's our cousins. We want the best for their youth and their future generations. We want to walk together, and that'll never change. We'll support them in court as interveners. We'll support their people who choose to transition off reserve or who lose their status through the disgusting math that Canada and the Crown uses to decide who an Indian is and isn't. We'll fight some of their Indian Act leaders, though, who have chosen for reasons only known to themselves to act as the Indian agents of the day. As we see here with Jessica, our youth are smart, they're strong, they're determined, and they're armed with the power of knowing both ways of seeing by being an Indigenous person growing up in a colonial world. They represent those who are spoken of in our prophecies, standing with one leg in both worlds, seeing with one eye in both worlds. They're the two-eyed seers that will bring unity and diversity as they dismantle discrimination and distinction. They'll create the path where we all walk together. They're a blessing from the Creator, and we are so fortunate to have and to witness them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Our next panelist has already been introduced at this point. Our National Representative, Jessica Savoy, is going to take a moment to talk about UNDRIP and self-determination.
Thank you, Bradley, and thank you, Brendan, for sharing the background and insight on what we're exploring, and also our experiences leading up to this event. Good morning or good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Jessica Savoy. My ancestral name is Nidilka, which means wings that are crossed, and I'm Niska from the House of Nisyok in the village of Gitlach-Damix. And Niska is a tribal nation which is located, our lands are located in northern British Columbia. And I do want to note that I was born and raised in unceded Coast Salish territories of what many know as Vancouver. And so, just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised off reserve. I got to see a lot of hardships and the racism of low expectation impacting Indigenous youth, and I think that's what really has brought me here to want to empower more Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, because I really do believe that if we want to reconcile, if that's even possible, we need to be doing that with our allies, with our co-conspirators, with all of our of what makes up our society. And so I'm here today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as self-determination as it relates to off-reserve Indigenous peoples and especially youth. So, as a national organization, we view the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the most comprehensive human rights instrument that explicitly addresses our rights, as well as providing a principled and normative legal framework for achieving justice and reconciliation for all off-reserve Indigenous peoples in Canada. I would like to note that in Canada, over 80% of Indigenous peoples live off-reserve, and the way that the federal government chooses to consult or engage with Indigenous peoples in Canada is through the distinctions-based approach, as Brendan had already mentioned. And what we mean by distinctions-based approach is, the federal government and actually all levels of government really want to engage Indigenous peoples in Canada through First Nations representatives, Métis, and Inuit. And by engaging with, the distinctions-based approach, it has explicitly left out any type of consultation with the 80% of Indigenous peoples living off-reserve in Canada. I note that in Canada, over 50% of the Indigenous peoples are under the age of 30, and so we are one of the fastest growing. We are the fastest growing demographic in Canada, and yet, right now with the current model, the federal government and the respective intergovernmental relations are failing our Indigenous youth and Indigenous peoples that choose to live off-reserve. We know that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People lay out the minimum standard of rights. And I think it's important to note that, the Declaration is a universal framework and must be integral to the development of meaningful, sustainable, and ethical engagement with urban Indigenous peoples. In 2019, the provincial government of British Columbia passed a bill, Bill 41, which is the first jurisdiction in Canada to make UNDRIP into law. At that time, I was actually in the Legislative Assembly, and it was such a beautiful time. I thought it was just an amazing, thing to witness, UNDRIP being introduced, and that was the first step for it to be made into law. And then I realized that by doing that, they literally excluded any type of consultation with off-reserve Indigenous peoples, and the reality set in. And so I think right now, with the current model of different governments having consultation process with, the way the current model is not working, and a lot of consultation within urban environments are made through different organizations who are ultimately responsible to the government because they receive that kind of contract dollar, and so it's a problematic system. On September 13, 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration, And finally, in 2016, the Government of Canada endorsed the declaration without qualification and committed to its full and effective implementation. Most importantly, this declaration outlined the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous right to health means that Indigenous peoples should have full access to healthcare services in ways that are reflective of and responsive to Indigenous worldviews and conceptions of health without any discrimination. Upholding the Indigenous right to health is now firmly established as a foundation for addressing discrimination and racism within Indigenous peoples. So when I'm talking about health, I mean like the social determinants of health, everything that is affecting an Indigenous person's well-being, even the social, economic, and political environments. Right now, currently, the structure is not working, and ultimately, our people are dying because of it. Self-determination speaks to control by Indigenous peoples over inter alia, health, and well-being, including through Indigenous governing institutions, jurisdiction, and law. I would like to note that at the height of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Canadian federal government pushed through their definition of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples without any consultation with the offers of Indigenous peoples, and ultimately leaving out the most vulnerable voices, the people that are actually on the ground experiencing and having their rights exploited through different levels of jurisdiction, policies, organizations, law enforcement, and so on. And so right now, as Brendan had mentioned, the Canadian government created or put forward a reconciliation council on for Indigenous peoples, and it was a problematic approach because the government again chose to engage with through the distinctions-based approach, and it's becoming an ongoing colonial instrument that has that is not everyone is aware of how the federal government is choosing to engage Indigenous peoples. It's really neo-colonial, and the structure is not really inclusive, especially to Indigenous youth who are off reserve, which is really the majority of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous youth who are in Canada. There needs to be change. Change needs to happen in order to really uphold Indigenous people's rights in Canada. Right now, the current model is not working, and ultimately, the voice of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and the work that we're doing, we're really trying to advance and uphold the offers of Indigenous people's rights, so they can have the bare minimum standards of their rights upheld. I think I'll leave it at that. I'd love to answer any questions if there may be at the end. I really just wanted to highlight United Nations Declaration and also self-determination through an Indigenous youth lens. And I also want to give thanks to everyone being here. I know the energy is a little bit low today. It's kind of a slower day at the UN, and so just being here with you all I'm really grateful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll move on to our panelists now. President Chief Lisa Cooper, Canadian Council Prince Edward Island, talk about some of the agreements that CAP has made with Canada over the years, including the CAP Daniel decision and the MMIWG missing murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Thank you, Quay, Ninda Luisi, Lisa. I'm turning on the mic. I did not turn on the mic. Technology eludes me. So again, Quay, Ninda Luisi, Lisa Cooper. My name is Lisa Cooper. I was looking at the picture previously on the slide, and my mother would have been one of those lining up back with the Daniels and fighting for the Daniels decision. My mother is a residential school survivor. She attended Shubenacadie Residential School at the age of 6, and probably for about 6 or 7 years. So she was one of the ones that got paid out for the residential school settlement. her experiences in the residential school was atrocious. That's her story to tell, so I don't want to be here to tell her story, but I can tell you the impact it has on her kids is very traumatic. You know, we weren't accepted in our community, and Brendan had talked about that, because my mother, after leaving the residential school, did not fit in her community anymore. She didn't know the ways of the community. She lost her ability to speak Mi'kmaq and a lot more. She lost a lot more, and then when they were doing the residential school payout and stuff, she had to retell her story, every detail, to a committee that was made up of non-Indigenous people who judged her settlement based on the detail and amount of abuse and the type of abuse that she went through. So it was never my mission to be the president chief of the Native Council. My mother was one of the original vice presidents of the Native Council. When she chose to marry my father, who is French, my grandmother disowned her and all of us subsequent, blaming my mother for marrying out of her community, is how she's seen it. So my mother had lost status. She was no longer seen as a status Indian. I was born in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I believe part of the reason that she moved to the States was to avoid Canada from removing us and putting us into a residential school. So unfortunately, because of that, her experience in residential school, I also lost the ability to speak French, because my mother would not allow any other language in my household except English. So I lost my French, my Mi'kmaq. So subsequent to that, we fought, as part of the Native Council of Prince Edward Island, we fought the Bill C-31, which was a ruling that happened and it passed, and it gave my mother her status back, and her first generation, which is me. However, non-Indigenous women who gained status through marriage at that time didn't lose their status. So we have a lot of non-Indigenous women with status cards out there. The government didn't renege them. So they had all the rights and privileges that my mother didn't have, but under the Bill C-31, she gained her status back and I gained mine. And they became a status Indian government size. And then again, we fought for MacGyver, and MacGyver came out and it allowed me to pass my status on to my children. And then more recently, Deschanel, which allows me to pass it on to one of my granddaughters, one of my grandchildren, because according to Canada, I have given birth to 3 children, 3 boys, but only one can pass status because he was born prior to 1985. And the other 2 who were born after 1985 cannot pass status down. So I don't know how Canada perceives that this is okay within our community, that I give birth to 3 kids and only one will be recognized and be able to pass that status down and the other 2 can't. So these are fights that we've had with the government of Canada over and over, and I think we talk about the high level politics, but the impact on our community is really hard, because we are seen as less than our brothers and sisters on reserve, our cousins on reserve. We're not welcome on their reserves. When we immigrated, I stayed with my grandmother. Our family, 7 of us, stayed with my grandmother, and we weren't there any more than 2 months, and she kicked us off the reserve and told us because we don't belong there. This is the history of how we came together as the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. Each of our provinces fought that. The Native Council of Prince Edward Island actually started in Local 17 in the Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council. So they were our incubator for that first year, and then we got an agreement with CMHC for the Negum housing, 56 rent guarantee income units, and then we came to PEI. Well, we took our organization back to PEI after the incubation of New Brunswick, and then we created the Native Council. We changed our name to the Native Council of Prince Edward Island. We are the longest standing tripartite holder between the province and the PTOs in Canada, provincial territorial organizations. We are the incubator for the court worker program and the National Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse programs. The federal government approached us because reserves weren't situated enough to handle these programs at the time. And we actually ran those programs, and we created those programs and worked with the federal government, and then when the bands got situated, then we were tossed aside. After 40 years with the funding, they said, oh, well, you're not a reserve, so we can't fund you. That's the ongoing disparity that we had. So as I said earlier, my mother was one of the first original vice presidents and fought alongside the rest of the CAP community, or the 11 provinces, PTOs, with the Daniels. After 14 years in court, the Daniels decision was answering a question we had asked: who is responsible for us? We had the provincial government saying, you're Indians, you're federal responsibility. We had the federal government saying to us, no, you're not an Indian. Not in our definition, because you don't live on a reserve. We created these reserves, colonial reserves, and you don't live on a reserve, so you're not an Indian. You don't have a status. You have a non-status. So it was a football of who was going to actually be responsible for us as Indigenous peoples. And after 16 years, I watched the Daniels court case, and I would recommend for anyone to watch it, because after 16 years in court, the federal government said, you know what, we're not going to fight this, you're right. When it served our purpose, we treated them as Indians. We took them away, we put them into residential schools, and we sent them off to 60 Scoop and put them out for adoption and the highest rate of child welfare. Yeah, we did all that. So yes, we did kind of treat them as Indians, so we'll take responsibility. Why did you get us in court for 16 years? Why didn't you just acknowledge the wrong? But if you look behind the Daniels, a lot of the paperwork that came out that was hidden documents was those that said they knew exactly who CAP and their constituents are. They knew exactly who the off reserve were. They knew how many of us there was, because they quoted that it would be about $4 billion to bring us up to par to our brothers and sisters. How do you come up with that number? I'm a school teacher. A plus B, or A multiplied by B. So don't ask me who we are. You know who we are. That was one of the biggest ones that they had, was $4 billion. They also found in the Daniels court case that we, as then at the time we were called the Métis and non-status Indians, was the most impoverished in all of Canada. We are the most impoverished, is what the Daniels said in 2016. As unfortunately, government doesn't see us as priority. They see those three groups. Am I here to fight with my brothers and sisters that have recognition? No. But the Constitution, Section 35, says Indians, Inuits, and Métis. I am an Indian. I am not a First Nations. Am I tied to a band? Absolutely tied to a band. That's colonial way. When my mother regained her status and I had gained my status, they asked what reserve my mother was from. I'm now part of a reserve. I don't have a say. Where do I never have a say on who represents me? I have no connection to the reserve. I have a lot of hurt, denial. Canada takes pride in sabotaging and undermining and discouraging unity among and between Indigenous groups. I call it an Alice in Wonderland effect. I hear my brothers and sisters at side events and at the national event where they're saying, you know, self-identity, self-determination. We determine who we are. No, you don't get to do that. I'm sorry, Assembly of First Nations, or the Métis National Council, or the Inuit Tapirika. You don't get to decide. The government decided for you. The government decided who was going to be the right holders, not you. Because if we had the right to determine, we would all be Indigenous and we would all be recognized. It's an Alice in Wonderland effect. You were one of the lucky chosen ones. Whether they put your name in a hat, your community in a hat, I don't know. Because we all have ties to our community, we all have ties to our Indigenous ways of living and beliefs. So Canada is the one that ultimately determines who Indigenous people are in Canada. We don't have a say. In 2018, I negotiated the political accord for the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, as I am the board of director. In the political accord, it was a year-long, if not 2-year-long, negotiation process, because we would not sign the political accord until there was a section put in there that government recognized that our PTOs, provincial territorial organizations, do have Indigenous people with Section 35 rights. And we got it. We got the political accord signed. It was a long negotiation process. Unfortunately, government still does not uphold our schedule of I think you nailed it, Jessica, the social determinants of health. Off-reserve Indigenous people are the highest dropout rate, the highest incarceration rate, the highest in suicide, the highest in every social determinant of health. Government knows we are the 80% that live off reserve, and I call it the 80-20 rule. 20% of the people live on reserve, they get 80% of the funding. 80% live off reserve, we get 20% of the funding. So you can imagine when I'm working with Indigenous peoples that are incarcerated for offenses that the community would find threatening, they are not allowed back to the reserves. The reserves don't want them. Where do they go? They go to urban, they come to us. They look to us for help. When there's a child being taken away from the community, where do they go? They come to us. And the CAPS PTOs. We service the off reserve and we do it well. In 2019, I also took on the MMIWG, or in 2019 the MMIWG final report came out, and the final report of the inquiry concluded that the highest level of violence directed at First Nations, Inuit, Métis women and girls is caused by state actions and inactions rooted in colonialism and colonial ideologies. It also concluded that the crisis constituted an ongoing race, identity, and gender-based genocide. Think about that. Canada, what's on the National Security Council? Would you want them on there? Genocide. Canada doesn't deserve to be there until they can deal with their own backdoor stuff, skeletons in their closets. So out of that came 231 individual calls for justice directed at government, institutions, social services, providers, industries, and all Canadians. That led to the development of the MMIWG National Action Plan Canada created. It's the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Action Plan. It brought 20 to 30 different Indigenous organizations regardless of your status, if the government recognized you as an Indigenous group or not. It included women's groups. I was there on behalf of CAP, and I'll tell you, it was 2 years of lateral violence at its finest. Those that had recognized rights were saying, why was I there? What right did I have to be there? Because they represent the people that I have. Thus, like I said earlier, if I'm on their ban list, well, I've never been on the reserve, but they have a right, I guess. I didn't give it to them, but it was a fight. After about 2 years, we finally got our section in the National Action Plan. So if you Google the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Action Plan, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples has a chapter. We deserve to have that chapter. We are the ones dealing with the 80% of the population. A lot of our Indigenous women and girls go missing in urban centers or rural areas. Highway of Tears, for example, and other places. When they leave the reserve, they go to urban centers. That's where we're getting them. We had lost a young woman last year in PEI. That was felt by everyone in my community. Everyone. And if that impact is as high as it was, why is government not bringing us to the table for the Reconciliation Council, which was alluded to earlier? Canada doesn't want us at the table. So we finally got that, and then 2021, Canada's National Action Plan. Oh, well, we already talked about that one, didn't you? Didn't you talk about that one yesterday, Judy? So anyway, points I wanted to make, just to close up, is Canada often says that they want to have engagement. They will always say that they want to have an engagement with us. They never want to consult. Because there is a difference between a duty to consult, honor of the crown, that they will never use when they're discussing anything about our rights. They always say they want to engage with my community. Engaging with my community and not consulting, to me, is a dishonor to my granddaughter, a dishonor to me, and mostly a dishonor to my mother. Because as now she gets older and is living with dementia, she's reliving again what she went through. How does government tell me that I can't be at that table? That I cannot speak on behalf of my mother or my children? Why should she have to relive this again? Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Cooper. As you've now heard from our three panelists, we'd like to open up to the floor. If anyone would like to ask questions, you can do so by raising your hand. I do have some questions of my own. I heard as it went through, so if there's nobody else who will ask questions, I'm going to start over with mine, and let me even jump in if some other questions come to mind. So I'll begin with my questions. Chief Moore, the question I have for you, you mentioned a lot about identity politics, the idea that some people may be more Indigenous than others, and this kind of went through a lot of your conversational pieces. And the one question I have for you is, with these ideas that there are other people who are trying to define what your community is and what it isn't, I'd like to hear from you, what is your community? Who does it represent? How do you determine who is your community and who isn't? What is your idea of identity that you determine for yourself?
Well, so I guess the way that our community accepts members, I guess, my family story is again pretty relevant here. So when we joined in 1981, we didn't have the court case yet or all of our genealogy at that time to be able to be considered a full member. So we were always associate members, which allowed us to be around the community, but never allowed us to participate in any of the politics or the voting. But it was still our people, and we were still allowed to be heard in dialogue, even though we couldn't vote. So over the years, I think it took about 13 years, and then we eventually put together our genealogy and had the court case which validated us. And so our community, and because we were accepted by the community, so our community is made up of people who have connection to Indigenous communities, who have Indigenous ancestry, and who go through a community acceptance process to be brought into our community, and it seems to work really well, and we've grown a lot over the years at a reasonable pace with that structure.
Thank you. I'll go to my next question for Jessica Savoy, National Youth Representative. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're brought forward a youth voice for a lot of these things, especially this being the year in which UNDRIP is recognized through the youth voice. It's definitely important to have that perspective here. You mentioned that Canada had endorsed UNDRIP coming into 2016, and we know many other countries that endorsed it much earlier, 2007. This path that Canada's on, it looks like it may not be implemented in time for a lot of up-and-coming youth to really be impacted by a lot of this work. So I'd like to use your perspective as a youth, the path that Canada's on right now, what does that mean for future youth, and what do you think Canada needs to change in order to make it a better future for youth under this UNDRIP model that they're doing?
Thank you, Bradley, for your question. Youth believe that the path of reconciliation and justice should start with education and really identifying and exploring, the historical but also current injustices that are impacting Indigenous peoples across the country. And so I think the current path that Canada is taking is going to have a detrimental effect on Indigenous youth across the country. And we see, all of the data is in front of us. I live in Vancouver, and I grew up in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Canada, right in the downtown east side. And so I got to witness the extreme environments that our youth are exposed to. And throughout even the pandemic, the conditions have gotten worse. And so with the current model and how, consultation processes and engagement, how that process is happening right now, there's a huge risk of excluding the majority of Indigenous peoples who do not or do not have their voices represented through the distinction-based approach. I hope that answered your question. I know that there's a lot more that we could explore as well, but yeah, I think that the change needs to happen, and we owe it to our youth, we owe it to our communities, our elders, we owe it to all of Indigenous peoples, and I think the work needs to happen hand in hand with non-Indigenous people as well.
Thank you, Jessica. I know this year being the theme of youth voices, I know there's a lot of times where many leaders look towards youth for a lot of answers. I know that there's a lot of expectations and fortunately a lot of responsibility they're picking up from us. So I'm really glad to hear a lot of your answers and vision that you have for the future. My next question is for Chief Cooper. Make sure everyone has their opportunity to speak on here. You mentioned that in preparing the MIWG National Action Plan, you'd experienced a lot of violence amongst other Indigenous leaders, and I believe Chief Moore mentioned that there was even a conference where you were almost arrested. Thankfully, it didn't occur, but it seems as if, I can be blunt at this point, it seems that there's a lot of harm that's been done, a lot of relationships that have been damaged through a lot of this process. So, if I could have your input on that, and how do we move forward in repairing that relationship, not only with the government, but it seems even with other Indigenous peoples as well.
You know, it's hard because I'm sorry, I'm not technology challenged here, the old school. It's really hard. I mean, it's hard to work with and negotiate a government that you see destroyed your family, your mother, the community, the family. It's hard to trust. Trust is very hard. And when we went to, because I was part of that, creating that National Action Plan, MMIWG for CAP, and then go to an event where we were only allowed on Zoom, even though the event was happening basically just down the hall, I found was an insult to us. Why could we not be in that? Why could our youth not be in there to have been heard? If you're asking us what we have done, why were we not there? And they kept saying that we couldn't go there. Well, I said to the elders and the youth, they're not going to let us in. And the wisdom of the elders was they just quietly stood up, took the hand drum, followed by the youth down the hall, around the corner, and I followed. And I drummed and I sang. Now the night before that morning we had an event where we welcomed everyone into our room as Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, and many people came in that were at that event. So they would be a chief of a reserve, a deputy minister, or a minister. They came in, and even for the Native Women's Association, and supported what we were doing. So when the elders went down the hall in front of that door and started to drum healing songs and warrior songs, some of the women in that event came out, the elders came out and joined our group and sang. Suddenly we started getting surrounded by the security guards, and they were standing so close to our elders and intimidating them and almost trying to hurt us like cattle. And my defenses came up, and I was like, no, you're not doing this to my elders. No, you're not going after my elders and intimidating them this way. So I kind of got cornered alongside with them, and then seen the deputy minister, and I let her have it and said, you don't have her, because I upset her and she started to cry. I said, you don't have a right to cry. You've taken everything from me and my community. I have nothing to lose. And if it means I have to be arrested to protect my elders and my youth, I will be arrested, arrest me. And then the conversation went a little bit more, and then I got kind of pulled to the side. They doubled the security. They put the fences up downstairs. They were intimidating us at every point of the way, like we didn't have a right to be there. And that's been my history and my journey with the government, is I don't have a right to be at these tables. I don't have a right to advocate for my youth. I don't have a right to advocate. What needs to happen to move forward is for Canada to stop playing games, stop making us go back to court case after court case after court case. We're winning. Why is Canada doing this? Their Justice Directorate says it's better to negotiate than litigate. Why are you making us litigate? It doesn't make sense. It also says if there are competing groups of Indigenous peoples, the government is not supposed to get involved. It's right on their Justice Canada website. Look it up. Justice Director. Those 2 points, and I keep reminding them. Canada shouldn't be choosing who we are. That's up to us to decide who we are. And if I'm looking forward as to how we can move forward, I think the turning point in our relationship is work with us, better understand what we do. You don't have to agree with who we are, but be respectful of what we do and how we help the community. Leave the Indigenous politics to the Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Cooper. Question?
Early on. Can you hear me? So it's more of a comment than a question. So I'm Jim DeVoe, I'm the CEO of the Congress. I've been in the Congress for 12 years. Pre this existing Liberal government and during this Liberal government. And the distinctions-based approach that our leaders talked about today, I won't repeat. But I was very, very interested in hearing from one of the beneficiaries of the distinctions-based approach, and that was one of the regional chiefs of the AFN. You may have heard of him on the floor the other day. And he talked about how everything is getting worse. Things are getting worse. Numbers are statistically getting worse in Canada for Indigenous people, higher crime rate, higher drug, so on and so forth. And the second largest investment in Canadian history was with this government to Indigenous people, next to Brian Mulroney, the former Prime Minister. So why is it that so much money is going into a small group of Indigenous people, yet the numbers are getting so much worse? You know, this distinctions-based approach has not worked. And I really hold up my leaders here because never once in the 12 years I've been at CAP, the Congress of Aboriginal People, the acronym CAP, have I ever heard anybody saying those other groups shouldn't have equal place, ever. Contrary to what I hear all over the place, I've never once heard that. And with all the negativity that's been flowed in our direction, it'd be easy to be that negative, and I've never once heard it. So miigwech to our leaders, you've done an amazing job representing us today. Thank you.
Just in comment to that about the identity, because I heard it yesterday, and I heard it on the floor, this thing about identity. And now that, like, I told you my story, my mother lost her status. So when my mother lost her status, I thought it was a Métis. So I called myself a Métis. My father's French, my mother's Indian. What's the definition of Métis? I called myself a Métis. And then after that, when Bill C-31 came out and then I got my status, now I'm an Indian. But no, wait, now I'm not an Indian. I'm not a non-status Indian. Now I'm a status. So when you hear on the floor, especially from Canada's perspective, a lot of these, organizations, my brothers and sisters, I'm not against them. My fight is not with them. My fight is with the government. But when I hear them talk about identity, these pop-up groups, these Métis groups, think about the struggles that our youth go through. Because I went through that. I don't know who I am. What's my identity? I'm not welcome on a reserve. I'm told that I don't want to use the word my grandmother used, but that was my mother that did that to us. And then to have these terms brought out that I'm this, and I'm that, I'm this, and I'm that. How are youth supposed to form an identity if they're told they don't belong? And because more Aboriginal youth are coming to the urban centers, I take pride in their nation. Whether you're Coast Salish, you're Algonquin, you're Métis, you're Inuit, whatever you identify with and communicate, I honor that. I am Mi'kmaq, and I'm proud of Mi'kmaq. One of the original signatories to a treaty. I am proud to be Mi'kmaq. But I don't have a right to tell you, you don't have a right in my province, and you don't have a right to my access to my resources and my programs. But the bands do that because they're not Mi'kmaq. They're very centrally focused. That's not who we are. We have mobility rights. I am a Mi'kmaq in New York. I'm a Mi'kmaq PI, and I'm a Mi'kmaq in New Zealand. If I decide to go, I have mobility rights. I am always Mi'kmaq. But the way the government happens to do this, Jim, is the identity of our youth is always being questioned, and their right to belong and their feeling to belong. What does that lead to? Increased poverty, self-esteem drops, suicide rates. You're supposed to embrace each other, not what we're doing, which is the divide and conquer. Government's doing well in doing that.
All right, I'll open up to the floor one more time. Any last questions?
Yeah. I wondered if you were comfortable just talk more about the MMIWG, about who they are and some of the work that they've done. Only if you want to.
The MMIWG is about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It was an inquiry that was the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and the Native Women's Association of Canada was advocating with the federal government about the number of women that were missing and murdered. I think Jessica can speak about the Highway of Tears, that there were certain places where Indigenous women were being targeted. So they called for an inquiry to be done. So the inquiry brought all the Indigenous peoples together who experienced the loss of a loved one. And they did that, I think it was all through 2017, 18, 19, around there. And then 2019, they came out with a huge report. You can Google it, it's about this big. But then part of that report gave light to 231 individual calls to justice. How do we address missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? So they created this national action plan, and every province could take part in it, Indigenous groups could take part in it, and then, you know, it's the idea is that we work in unity, we work as one, because everyone has issues with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So it looks at what puts them at risk. You know, for me in PEI, what put my women at risk would be different than Brendan's and different than Jessica's, because I'm Prince Edward Island, I'm like a sand dune. If you see PEI on the map, we're the smallest province. I don't have a lot of missing and murdered Indigenous women because they'll leave my province and they'll go to New Brunswick where they're scooped up there and sex trafficked. Or Jessica's community, you know, she could speak on that and I'll let them speak on that. But for me, the national MMIWG inquiry was about how do we keep our girls safe. So for me, mine is mostly the couch surfing. They will couch surf and exchange sexual favors for a place to sleep. They're vulnerable. They're taken advantage of. They'll leave our province and then we don't see them again. Or like what happened last summer, her name is Summer. That's why I'm going last summer, her name is Summer. Summer Kneebone went missing and we did a whole search. We put it out to Facebook, over 300 people showed up. Even people that are not part of my community showed up and we did a search, and unfortunately she was found deceased. So a lot of homeless people, couch surfers, those are where we find the missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. There's also something that CAP advocates for, and I do as well, is missing and murdered Indigenous men and boys. Did you want to say something about that?
So, you know, for a lot of us, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, it's not a political thing. It's really personal, because we all have people who we've lost. You know, I had one of my aunts was raped and murdered, and that day could have gone very different if she was treated like she was a human being. My mother saw that day that things weren't going well for her, and she requested that the RCMP do a well-being check on her, and they failed to do so because she had a reputation with the RCMP. You know, she lived a troubled life and had a lot of problems, so to them she was just a problem. And then when they found her the next morning, they put it aside to a non-suspicious death. So my mother and my aunt, they fought, and we ended up getting a provincial inquest into her death eventually. And you know, there was a lot that came out of that, and that the RCMP, you know, didn't do their due diligence, and you know, as they don't, our women are easy targets because nobody really looks for them, nobody cares for them. It's easy things to happen. One of my cousin's partner, she was just found dead again maybe 5 months ago, and the coroner didn't even do an autopsy. She was already embalmed before the family found out that nothing had even been checked, and they deemed that one non-suspicious as well. You know, we had a couple years ago, we had RCMP go to do a well-being check on a woman in northern New Brunswick, and he shot her in the back multiple times, claiming it was self-defense, and he got off with self-defense. So this is something, you know, you go out west in the prairies, and you have gangs just scooping up these women and trafficking them, and RCMP taking them, raping them, killing them. They're just vulnerable, and nobody puts any time into trying to stop it or to protect them. And so when you have these targets that have nobody looking out for them, it makes it easy for people to look to them to use as if they're nothing but things for their profits or for their own pleasure.
Do you want to say something, Jessica?
No, I think that's it.
We have one final question here. We're getting a little short on time, but
No problem. I'm not going to use the microphone. I'll just use my big house voice since I'm from the west coast of Canada. So good morning, everyone. My name is Wilfred Coots. I'm the chief of the Ho-Chukatsi tribe. I come from BC. It's good to see one of my cousins from a neighboring nation. I just wanted to say Kleko for all the work you're doing. You're finding those who have been, there's no English word for it. Denied, I guess, is a good one. So that fire and that passion that you have within you is your ancestors giving you that push to continue that good work. So I'll hold my hands up to you for finding those who don't have a home and giving them a house. So I appreciate that. Kleko. I just wanted to say Kleko.
Thank you.
Thank you, and that means a lot coming from a First Nations community, and an example where we can work together. We can show Canada that we, as Indigenous people, can support each other. My role is very different for off reserve than it is for on reserve, and when I can, I refer to them on the reserve as much as I can if that's what they want to go back to, because that's their community. But if they don't want to live on reserve, their rights don't leave them when they leave the reserve. So there's a possibility, and there is a way for the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and the First Nations communities to work together. And if people went back in history, we all started as the League of Indians, which was the first group to gather when we were allowed to gather legally. I know my history. Then from there was National Indian Brotherhood and the Native Council of Canada. That came from that one. And we split not because we believed one was better than the other. We split because we acknowledge that the rights and the needs of the on-reserve is different than the rights and the needs of the off-reserve. Because on reserve, you have everyone close to you. But that's a challenge when you're dealing with some very sensitive issues. Off reserve, we don't have everyone close to us. So we value the teachings and we hold on to them. So there is a place for the both of us. And then after subsequent came the Métis that separated. So it's like a mother that gave birth to twins or triplets. And that's how I see it, because we all started as one. But government is neglecting one of her 3 children. Right? Thank you.